Oh man, the fourth and final session, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Thanks for making it this far. Thank you so much to, once again, to my colleagues that have helped me here, my MPED colleagues, my MPED instructor, Dr. Wilson, for her feedback. I'm just reflecting on, everything that I've been able to learn and share, and I'm thankful for it. So thank you. Let's get into some hands-on individual assessment and reports. We're going to talk about rubrics. We're going to talk about 4-point assessment. We're going to talk about grade books. Today is going to be the plane is going to land. All those untied loose ends are going to be tied up in a bow, and we're going to move forward. I'm so excited. Let's take a look at our continuum and see how far we've come. Here we are, we're still working towards comprehending standards-based learning continuums for mathematics, and today our focus is recognizing how learning success can be assessed and reported using a proficiency scale. Now, I don't know if you noticed this, but there's always been an enriching understanding. I do this just for my own, but now that we've done the last session, you can see to enrich understanding, you can design standards-based learning continuums for mathematics with colleagues. And how might you demonstrate problems of percentages to your colleagues? How might you develop learning continuums of your own? How might you apply the proficiency scale to your own assessment and reporting? So that's the next level beyond comprehension. But I'm still feeling fantastic, and I'm thankful, and I'm looking forward to unpacking the proficiency scale today, individual assessments and reports. Here we see a proficiency scale. This is from the BC Ministry of Education. There's 4 points to this proficiency scale, or 4 gradations. And like we said earlier, the more gradations in percentages leads to more issues. So we have less. Each one is thoroughly described as well. Currently, if we remember, in our first vignette, there was a student that scored 75 and a friend that scored 76. We couldn't tell the difference between the 2 gradations. Where here, they're nicely defined. Emerging means that the student demonstrates an initial understanding of the competencies relevant to the expected learning. Developing means a student demonstrates a partial understanding of the concept and competencies relevant to the expected learning. Proficient means the student demonstrates a complete understanding of the concepts and competencies relevant to the expected learning. And extending means that the student demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the concepts and competencies relevant to the expected learning. The idea is initial understanding, partial understanding, complete understanding, and sophisticated understanding. And to some extent, this mirrors our learning continuum, where a complete understanding is proficient. I can do this, and this means I can do this. And sophisticated understanding would be going deeper, next level of Bloom's taxonomy, but we'll get to that. So, some more information. Can the student accomplish the learning target? Emerging and developing? Not yet. They haven't. Proficient? Yes, they can. They can do it. And extending? Yes, with depth. Standards-based grading is about accomplishing goals. And here we can see whether students have accomplished them or not, or if they've gone beyond what's expected or gone deeper. Emerging is an initial understanding. Developing is a partial understanding. Proficient is a complete understanding. And extending is a sophisticated understanding. How could the student's learning be described? Well, you could use these words that the student is emerging in their understanding of solving problems using the Pythagorean theorem. The student is developing in their understanding of modeling proportions. The student is proficient when using fraction operations. And the student is extending their understanding of proportions. So we could also have the students respond. This is the teacher description. The students can say, well, if they're emerging, I am still learning this. Developing, I can do some of this. Proficient, I can do this. And extending, I can do this and more. Asterisks beside more, because we know that, as we learned yesterday, repeated proficiency is not an extension. So, and pizzazz or flair is not an extension. So the more must refer to something more sophisticated. So the question becomes, how does the teacher evaluate whether a student has an initial, partial, or complete or sophisticated understanding of the learning target we're evaluating? This is where clarity comes all together. Rather than using point totals to identify if a learning goal has been met, we use criteria. Let's take a look. When I'm proficient, I can model proportions. And there's 4 pieces of success criteria that I must satisfy to show that I can model proportions. So when a student hands in their proportional model, I see if they've satisfied the criteria. I see, have you identified a real life context? And I could do check, or I could say, well done with this part. I could comment. Have they constructed it with accuracy, care, and pride? Check. Or missing some of this, not quite accurate enough, missing a decimal spot, no care and pride, something along those lines. Demonstrate how proportions are modeled in the constructed model, and calculate proportions with accuracy, steps, and algebra, no cross multiplication. I can comment on all of these. I could do check marks or a checklist. Students can look at these ahead of time to see that the assignment they're submitting is satisfying what it means to be proficient. And then on top of that, students have the opportunity to aim for extension or extending their learning. And those students who satisfy the criteria of what they could do with having reached early proficiency, we could assess those students as extending in their understanding of this learning target. In another example, we could look at the Pythagorean theorem. When I'm proficient, I can apply the Pythagorean theorem to solve a variety of problems. So when a student satisfies these criteria, you might ask, is there wiggle room? Well, you could say, of course, because we talked about professional judgment in the first 2 sessions at length. Some pieces of criteria are more important than others. So you might notice slight mistakes in certain criteria that prove less important than others. For example, you may have a student that may have an occasional mishap with manipulating a square or square root. However, they've used the Pythagorean theorem correctly and appropriately at all times, and they've clearly shown their math thinking. You might have some wiggle room to say, you know what, I think this student can apply the Pythagorean theorem based off of what you can see. But on the other hand, you might have a student that is having lapses in demonstrating their math thinking or clearly showing their math thinking. That might be a larger red flag because that is perhaps a more important piece of criteria for the student to prove that they're proficient. On the other hand, those are like students you might, to you, this is language people might not like either, but students that are on the bubble. Are you getting it? Are you not quite? You need to use your judgment. Professional judgment is something we can embrace because percentages were not as objective as we thought. They're much more subjective. But on the other hand, if a student is struggling to meet numerous pieces of criteria, they're very likely developing in their understanding. And if a student is still learning to approach the target, their understanding is emerging. Lastly, if a student has demonstrated strength on the learning target and maybe even completed their assignment perfectly, this does not mean that they are extending in their understanding. That is important. We talked about that in the previous lesson. In British Columbia, extending is defined by a sophisticated understanding. Just doing more of the same target is no more complex. So if a student has aimed to extend their learning, I'll assess the new target or the new question, one of these questions that we have. So that asks people the question, well, let's say a student tries to do the golden ratio, or they try one of these questions and they do terribly. They do not demonstrate at all that they have extended their understanding. And this happens. This happens because this allows students to take risks, which is a beautiful thing. But first, let's establish that typically students should not be aiming to extend their learning without having previously demonstrated proficiency. That's a problem. If you have students that are trying to go beyond, but they haven't worked on all of the rungs in the ladder previous, they need to reassess what they are trying, and the teachers can guide them. I would actually totally be guiding students. I find students that are proficient early and I push them to extend their thinking. And students that don't quite understand, I have to say, hey, you're still working on this. Let's not look at the golden ratio yet, or let's not look at imperfect squares. Let's not invent a formula. We still need to apply the Pythagorean theorem. So therefore, single point attempts to extend their understanding and come back empty-handed would have a proficient evaluation because of previous assignments. Let me say that again, just in case it was a bit muddy. Students only try extensions when they have already reached proficiency. So if they bomb the extension, they're still proficient. That was the goal the whole time. They're taking a risk in trying something new. If students have not previously reached proficiency, they cannot have a sophisticated understanding. They can't even try, according to this system. For example, if a student solves the extension problem or something by fluke, or maybe they did kind of understand it, but could not demonstrate proficiency on the earliest target or the earlier target that our final destination target, they're still working on developing a complete understanding. Standards-based grading focuses on the best pieces of evidence regarding a learning target. And if the extension was not the best piece of evidence, educators should feel like they have the liberty to look at other pieces of assessment that focused on that same target. We can always look back. And that's why it's sometimes good to have more than one assessment on your final destination target. When we begin to assess this way, we are embracing clarity. We planned for it in our curricular design. We're using professional judgment to best reflect student learning, and we're using assessment to focus students back onto their learning, as it should be. Remember the fractions test in the first session that did not reflect how a student had learned? This method shows us exactly what it is we're evaluating and by what means we're evaluating and how students can continue to learn. Design curriculum with targets in mind and assess using success criteria. It's a preferable alternative to percentages. Then use extension and enrichment to push students forward into a new category of sophistication. And then you can see the individual assessments just flourish. You can also see individual assessments that I've created in the second appendix, and I will show some of them here. But first, some quick tips. Use relevant or the most recent artifacts when assessing a learning target. So if a student, let's say you write apply the Pythagorean theorem quiz or test. If a student bombs the test, but you have a quiz that does the same target, use the quiz. It might be more relevant, or take a good look at it. On the other hand, if you have a student who has struggled the entire unit, but they show that they really got it on your final assessment, use the most recent one. Also, ask yourself which pieces of criteria are the most important when defining proficiency. Also, clearly articulate enrichment criteria to students. Let them know what they need to do to show that they've gone above and beyond so that they can aim to extend their learning. Then use the proficiency scale for the final destination target. The final destination, and I would encourage you not to use it as much for the earlier ones, but the final destination target, because that's what you're working towards. All these little ones, for students to keep hearing proficient, developing, emerging, or whatnot, it confuses them. And on top of it, it ruins the idea of extending, because extension needs to require a sophisticated understanding, and you may not be able to assess going above and beyond in a rich task or something like that, even though some students are. So I would encourage you use the proficiency scale almost exclusively on the final destination target. Then keep students in the loop. They need to know what's going on. They should be updated frequently of what's in your grade book. That shouldn't be a secret. Well, grade book, your learning target tracker. Hand out learning maps. Let students know where they're going and let them know what the extension is ahead of time. Then ensure student-friendly language is used. Never use a rubric that does not have I can or this means that. And also try single point rubrics. I have an example of a single point rubric here. And I believe I've discussed this a little bit at the beginning, but the whole purpose of this is to identify that students have satisfied the criteria. There are students who it's quite nuanced, where they will be strong in some criteria and growing in others. And we can be specific that some students are calculating well, but they're not demonstrating well. But they're demonstrating well, but they're not calculating accurately. And what I can do is I can take notes and I can type that. Well, I will show you a typed version, but I can write on here and then look and see, are we trending in the direction that shows students are proficient? So Here, and you can see this in the second appendix, there's a comment for each piece of success criteria. There's areas, some of them are areas of strength, and some of them are areas of growth. And students get this anecdotal feedback, and teachers use this to determine whether or not a student is proficient. And obviously, if they've tried the extension, to help determine if they're extending. Here's one that I think a lot of people might be curious about is how to assess a test without a point total. A point total is not necessary when you have criteria. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look throughout the test and see if they've trended in the direction of using the Pythagorean theorem at appropriate times. And I could say, you applied it correctly every time. Well done. Have they trended, or does their work show trends of accurately manipulating squares and square roots? And I say, yes, usually. At times we had rounding mistakes. Okay, that's good to note. But is that a deal breaker? Maybe not. Then, are they throughout their work, are they clearly showing their math thinking? And you can say, yes, consistently showed your math thinking. And you could comment on each piece of criteria, or you could check them off like a checklist to say, you need to do all of these things to show me you're proficient, okay? Or at least trend that you are doing these things most of the time. All of those things together start to show you how we can start to move away from percentages, and how everything we've done has led us to this point where all the goals and objectives and everything, it allows us to start to assess things without percentages, which is a really cool thing. You might want to listen to this again, or take a look at what it means, or listen again to what it means to be proficient, or to allow students to extend and whatnot. But I think this is where we're starting to see more hands-on material. Let's take a break, and then we're going to move forward and talk about reporting.